Everyone has at least one great story. What's yours? Story 1. I was reassigned to a team on the second floor. My desk was on the fourth floor. I stopped coming to the office. The fourth floor team assumed I had moved downstairs. The second floor team assumed I was still upstairs. So, I just worked from home instead. For over a year. Story 2. Back in the 90s, I worked at an engineering supply shop called Cogs Unlimited. It was basically a huge warehouse filled with thousands of different types of cogs and other equipment. It looked a bit like this. My job was to answer the phone, take orders, write down the serial numbers and quantities, and then pass that information to the other guys, who would locate the correct shelf and retrieve the parts to be sent to buyers. Anyway, our phone number was very similar to that of a Santa phone service, a hotline where kids could call and talk to a voice actor playing Santa. The problem was that we frequently got calls from kids expecting Santa, only to be greeted with a monotone Cogs Unlimited. At first, I would just tell them they had the wrong number. But as Christmas got closer, the calls became more frequent, so I had to do something. If it was a slow day and a kid called expecting Santa, I'd just play along, asking what they wanted for Christmas, telling them they were on the nice list, and so on. Unless the kid was rude. I remember one particularly annoying little brat who called and demanded an unreasonable number of presents. As Santa, I let him know he was on the naughty list and would only be getting coal. I also told him I had sent some of my elves to his house, where they would hide in the garden and scare him. A few minutes after I hung up, I got a furious call from his mother, demanding to know why I had said those things to her child. I told her we just sell cogs, and she had the wrong number. I never heard from her again. Story 3. I went to a house party once. People were scattered all over the place. Living room, dining room, bedroom, just drinking and chatting. At some point, a guy started hooking up with a girl. They went into the bedroom too. Well, you know. When they got there, they found 2 guys and another girl already inside. Realizing the couple was going to use the room, the others started to leave. However, one of the guys, as he was walking out, decided to turn off the lights. Then, noticing how pitch black the room became, he quietly shut the door and managed to stay inside, hidden. The couple got comfortable on the bed, making out and taking off their clothes, completely unaware that my friend was in the room, silently watching and jerking off. At some point, as your eyes adjust to the darkness, you start to see shapes, right? The girl was on all fours while the guy was going at it from behind, when suddenly she screamed, "Oh my God, there's someone here." Panicked, my friend quickly started apologizing, shoving himself back into his pants while fumbling for the light switch. That's when all 3 of them saw it. Another hidden ninja jerker had also managed to stay inside the room, standing in the corner, masturbating. Both of them mumbled apologies and bolted out of there. I have plenty of stories, but here's one. I went to a house party once. People were scattered all over. Living room, dining room, bedroom, just drinking and chatting. At some point, a guy started hooking up with a girl, and they went to the bedroom to, well, you know. When they got there, they found 2 guys and a girl already in the room. Realizing the couple wanted some privacy, the group started to leave. However, as one of the guys was walking out, he turned off the lights. Noticing how completely dark the room became, he silently closed the door and managed to stay inside, hidden. The couple began making out on the bed, undressing, unaware that my friend was lurking in the darkness, watching and, well, pleasuring himself. At some point, as your eyes tend to adjust to the dark, the girl, who was on all fours with the guy going at it from behind, suddenly screamed, "Oh my God, there's someone here." Panicked, my friend quickly started apologizing, tucking himself away and fumbling to turn on the lights. And that's when they all saw it. Another ninja jerker had also managed to stay hidden in the corner of the room, doing the exact same thing. Both of them awkwardly apologized and left. Story 4. I was in middle school in the early 1990s, around the time Sam's Club and similar warehouse stores started popping up. None of us could drive yet. Obviously, we were like 14, and few of our parents had memberships, so getting access to those stores was rare. Plus, none of us had jobs, so our budget was whatever allowance we could scrape together, maybe $5 here and there. One kid had a brilliant idea. He bought one of those massive bags of blow pops for $5. Let's say he walked away with about 100 lollipops, 5 cents each. He brought them to school and sold them for $0.25 apiece, selling out in just a few days. He did this for about 3 weeks before others caught on and joined the game. This led to some heated debates. Some kids argued that each seller had to pick a different kind of candy, while others insisted that blow pops were fair game. The original group decided that everyone needed their own product, essentially forming a mini cartel. Looking back, it's pretty funny. About a month later, a new kid entered the market, and he came in big. He must have spent $50, maybe $100, and had everything. But he quickly ran into a problem. The school started cracking down on student-run candy sales in the cafeteria, which had been the prime selling spot. Most of the other kids cashed out while they could, but this kid had way too much candy to just quit. There were only 4 classes after lunch, and you couldn't exactly sell during the first 2 periods, so that left maybe 5 or 6 decent opportunities to find customers. The bad news. By that point in the day, most students had the same classmates in every period, making it harder to find new buyers. The good news? Homeroom fell between 2nd and 3rd periods and had a completely different mix of students. More importantly, those students had different classmates in their own later periods. So, the kid with all the candy came up with a new strategy. He repackaged his inventory into Ziploc bags containing 5 pieces each and sold them for $1 per bag. That worked for a few days until another kid in his homeroom asked to buy 5 bags at a time. This kid explained that he was reselling them for 25 cents per piece, effectively getting a free piece of candy each day. He even had a few classmates who wanted to do the same thing. He offered $4 per batch so he could still make a profit, and the candy supplier agreed. By the end of the week, he had completely sold out and immediately reinvested another $50 into restocking. Word spread fast. Soon, other kids in homeroom wanted in, so he started selling 5-bag bundles to around 5 or 10 kids, each eager to make an easy $1 a day just by being middlemen. It was an easy pitch. Tell your friends how you flipped the candy for a quick profit, flash your wad of singles, and they'd be hooked. It worked for about 2 or 3 days. Then, the whole grade got flooded with candy sellers. What had once been a controlled market was now oversaturated. Candy was no longer scarce. It had become a commodity. Prices crashed to about 10 cents per piece, and the MLM-style supply chain collapsed under the weight of plummeting margins. The whole thing dried up almost overnight. And with teachers cracking down even harder, no one dared re-enter the market for months. Story 5. When I was 10, I rescued a 3-month-old puppy from a shelter. I was a shy kid, and I did everything with her. She was my best friend. A few years later, my parents divorced. I decided to live with my father, and shortly after the divorce, he started seeing a younger woman who didn't like dogs. Eventually, they got married, and one day, I came home from school to find that my puppy was gone. My dad had gotten rid of her to please his new wife. I was heartbroken. Fast forward 4 years to my junior year of high school. My grandmother received a call from a shelter saying, "We found your dog." Completely confused, she went to the shelter to see what they were talking about, and it turned out to be my baby girl. Thankfully, we had chipped her. Even though 4 years had passed, it didn't matter. I had her back, and I wasn't going to let anything take her away from me again. Now, at 22 and 5 years after getting her back, my nearly 13-year-old puppy is still with me. For those asking about my relationship with my dad now, we're okay. There's still a deep wound between us, but we've worked through it. He has apologized and acknowledged what he did, and that's what really matters to me because of how much it affected me as a kid. It will always hurt when I think about it, but those are years I can never get back, so I try to be understanding and positive about the situation, maybe more than I should. That said, if I'm being honest, he is a pretty big jerk, so the name-calling is fair. But I try to be the better person. Did my dog recognize me? I think so. My grandmother and I went to pick her up from the shelter together, and the moment I opened her cage, she ran straight to me and pressed against my chest. From that moment on, I just assumed she knew who I was. It was an incredibly nerve-wracking experience. I was terrified she wouldn't recognize me. Do I know what happened to her during those 4 years? No, and I probably never will. Apparently, my dad initially gave her to my aunt, who then arranged for a friend to give her to another friend, and so on. By the time I got her back, she was in terrible physical condition and had a lot of emotional scars. She was deathly afraid of men. It took months of rehabilitation to help her recover. Given her state, I think it's best that I never find out what she went through. Knowing might break me. Story 6. I grew up in a place called Taupo, New Zealand, and just outside of town is a volcano called Mount Ruapehu. One particular day, I was staring out the window when I noticed a thick plume of ash rising into the sky. I immediately told the teacher that the volcano had just erupted. But since I was known as the class clown, she thought it was just another one of my disruptions, until the quiet kid in class spoke up and confirmed it. She told us to stay put and left the classroom to discuss with the other teachers what to do. But by the time she returned, the ash had already reached us. It was 11 a.m. on a Tuesday, yet it was as dark as night. She then told us that if our parents usually picked us up, we should wait in class, but if we lived close by, we could leave. My best friend lived just down the road, so we grabbed our things and left. I'll never forget the moment we opened the classroom door and stepped outside. Everything was covered in a thick layer of soot and ash, and it was so dark. Crossing the road was terrifying. You could barely see the headlights of oncoming cars until they were right in front of you. Luckily, that was the only road we had to cross. The rest of the way home was through a gully that led straight to my backyard. The next morning, I woke up feeling colder than usual, but I was more focused on one thing. I just wanted to watch Captain Planet for once. I ran to the TV when my mother walked in and said, "I thought you'd be outside playing with the others." I had no idea what she meant. I looked outside my window, and to my complete shock, it had snowed at my house for the first time ever. Apparently, after a volcanic eruption, it can trigger something called a volcanic winter, which can cause sudden snowfall. I had the longest driveway in the neighborhood. It went downhill, had a slight turn, then dropped even further into a cul-de-sac. So all the neighborhood kids came over to play, sliding down my driveway over and over again. I've never been that happy in my entire life. I missed that day. Story 7. On my first day of first grade, I was waiting for the bus with my mother. The street we lived on connected to a busy main road that had a steep hill. As I stood there, I saw a woman speeding down the curve on a bicycle, way too fast. She hit a pothole, flipped over her handlebars, and crashed directly into a car coming up the road. Traffic came to a stop, and my mom immediately ran to her. Without hesitation, she took off her shirt and wrapped it around the woman's bleeding head. I stayed with her while my mom sprinted back to our house to call 911. This was the early 90s, and cell phones weren't a thing. Looking back, life must have been more trusting back then because no one seemed to think twice about a 6-year-old sitting with a bleeding, unconscious woman in the middle of the road. The real kicker? None of the passengers in the stopped cars did anything. They just stood around and watched. I truly believe that witnessing this strange and traumatic moment is what made me the overly cautious, paranoid child I became, and ultimately led me to pursue nursing as an adult. I will never, ever forget that woman. And to this day, I have no idea what happened to her after the ambulance came and took her away. Story 8. When I was in 4th grade, around 1994, my family visited St. Petersburg. After a few days there, we went for another walk around the city center along one of its canals. We had walked this exact same route just a few days prior. St. Petersburg isn't huge, and it's a beautiful place to explore. A little further down the street, we noticed a statue. Normally, this wouldn't have been a big deal. St. Petersburg is filled with incredible statues and art. But the thing was, this statue wasn't there a few days ago. We had walked this very street, and none of us remembered seeing it. That meant it had to have been put up just recently. Now, keep in mind, this was the early 90s. The entire country was in shambles. The economy was terrible. People were struggling with poverty and joblessness. There were food shortages. Yet somehow, someone decided it was a good time to install a brand new statue. It made no sense for the time period. At least, that's what my parents were saying. I was too young to fully grasp the situation. Still, being typical tourists, we decided to walk closer and check it out. Just as we started moving toward the statue, we heard some commotion behind us. Sirens. We turned around, and within seconds, we saw cars speeding toward us, police sirens blaring louder and louder. We quickly moved across the street, standing closer to a building to get out of the way. The noise was getting intense, and as the vehicles approached, I suddenly noticed something insane. One of the vehicles was a tank. A freaking tank. First, a car zoomed past us carrying some strange-looking equipment. Right behind it was the tank. Then came several police cars with their sirens at full blast. We were all frozen in shock, holding on to each other, completely bewildered. But it got even crazier. We followed the vehicles with our eyes, watching as they all sped in the exact direction we had been heading to check out the new statue. The first car swerved around the statue, but the tank? It didn't even slow down. It smashed head-on into the statue at full speed, obliterating it like it was nothing. We stood there, stunned, jaws on the floor. What the hell just happened? Are we at war? Is this some kind of rebellion? A military coup? In the early 90s Russia, all of those were reasonable concerns. My parents and brother were frantically discussing possibilities while scanning the street for clues. That's when we noticed a lone policeman standing down the road. He wasn't moving. He wasn't calling for backup. He was just staring, right at the spot where the statue had stood, in the direction where the tank had driven off. My dad decided to go ask him what the hell was going on. While my mom, brother, and I waited, my dad walked over to the officer. They spoke for a few minutes, and as my dad turned back toward us, we could immediately tell his posture was more relaxed, and he even had a slight smirk on his face. What did the policeman say? We all asked at once. With a small chuckle, my dad replied, "It's the Americans. They're shooting a new James Bond movie. It's called GoldenEye or something." Story 9. When I was 16, 2 friends and I stole 23 garden gnomes from a single street, 16 from one house and the rest from a house across the road. Our haul also included a little elf house and a pretty hefty stone toadstool. Why? Because we were teenagers. It was the year 2000. We lived in a small town in England, and we had absolutely nothing better to do. We set them up on my friend's downstairs coffee table, pushed the table directly in front of the living room door, and waited. The idea was that when his mom got up for work, she'd properly shit herself. It worked. Screams happened. Words were said. And grounding was the inevitable consequence. A few weeks later, I was over at my friend's house when his mom, clearly fed up, told him in no uncertain terms to get rid of the gnomes, or at least some of them, because, and I quote, "they're a pain in the arse." Being a good son, he agreed. And being a good friend, he came up with a plan. A couple of hours later, we had backpacks full of war-damaged gnomes, smashed with hammers, covered in fake blood, and even accessorized. One gnome had a tiny sling. Another had a makeshift cast on its leg. We also wrote a note from the leader of the United Gnome Nation. The note explained that the gnomes of this street had been called to war against the evil gnome empire to protect the realm. It accounted for the missing gnomes and justified their absence. It was also filled with 4-letter words because, at 16, we thought we were the coolest people alive. That night, we placed the wounded gnomes in front of the owner's garden gate, propped the note up against the leader, and walked away as if nothing had ever happened. A week later, a friend came over holding a copy of the Wokingham Times. Front and center on the front page was an article titled, "Seeing Red, a Prankster's Gnome Joke." It detailed how sick pranksters had returned a woman's stolen garden ornaments covered in fake blood. That's right, before Reddit even existed, I made front-page news with a gnome prank. And yes, I'll post a picture of the article when I get home tonight. Story 10. When I was 18, I watched my father die in a random driveway as I gave him CPR. He had a heart attack while out on a walk with my mother. Panicked, she ran into a nearby house, called 911, and then called me. At the time, I was an off-duty EMT at home, and I arrived on the scene at the same time as emergency services. When I got there, I immediately started chest compressions while a firefighter used an ambu bag to help him breathe. Every single second of that moment is burned into my memory. I can recall it in vivid detail. I've written it down many times in an attempt to process it, to get it out of my head. But for years, I was haunted by nightmares, unable to erase the image of my father's vomit-covered, lifeless face from my mind. After a few minutes of CPR, a defibrillator arrived. They shocked my dad once. For a moment, he regained a sinus rhythm, but then he flatlined again. We loaded him into the ambulance and rushed him to the hospital. He was declared DOA. I remember my mother, softly holding back tears, asking me, "Is everything going to be okay?" I was 18. I had no idea what to say, so I told her the only thing I could think of. Nobody is dead until a doctor says they're dead. She told me to go home and call our family to let them know what had happened. When I got home, I completely broke down. Then, somehow, I pulled myself together. I had to make the worst phone calls of my life. I had to call my grandmother and tell her that her son was dead. I had to call his brother and sister and tell them their brother was gone. I had to call my own siblings and tell them our father had died. Before I could muster the strength to start, my mother called from the hospital. The doctors had officially declared him dead. And then, I had to say the words out loud. Over and over again. It was fucked up. I hate thinking about it. I wouldn't wish that experience on my worst enemy. Even now, writing this out, I feel numb. It brings back flashes of images I never want to see again. The anniversary is May 9th. This year will mark 22 years. Story 11. One random weekday afternoon, my girlfriend and I were both off work and ended up at an arcade near the bowling alley and cinema complex. In the UK, not sure about elsewhere, these places always have machines where you can win small amounts of coins and useless toys. So, I went to the change machine to get some 10p coins. I put in 20p, expecting to get 2x 10p coins in return. Instead, 2x £1 coins dropped out. Strange. I still wanted my 10p coins, so I tried again with another 20p coin I had in my pocket. Once again, 2x £1 coins came out. At this point, I knew something was up. I called my girlfriend over and told her, I just put 40p into this machine, and it gave me £4 back. Curious, I tried putting in the only other coin I had, a 50p coin, and sure enough, 5x £1 coins dropped out. Now I was really confused. So, I tried putting in a £1 coin, and got 10x £1 coins back. Neither of us could quite believe what was happening. I tried a couple more times, just recycling the £1 coins back into the machine, and every time, it spat out 10x £1 coins in return. After about 4 rounds of this, nothing happened. The machine must have run out of coins. By now, my pockets were stuffed with £1 coins. Then, I spotted another change machine nearby. I cautiously put in a £1 coin, and magically, it happened again. 10x £1 coins came pouring out. Both machines were doing this. We were both excited, confused, and incredibly paranoid. The whole arcade was eerily empty, with no one around. It felt like we had just stumbled into a glitch in the Matrix. At this point, we both had more money than we could carry, and the paranoia kicked in hard. Something fucking weird is going on here. We should probably leave. So, we speed walked out of there, me looking like some kind of paranoid Basil Fawlty, just desperate to get to the car so we could collect our thoughts. My pockets were so full of £1 coins that my trousers were literally falling down under the weight. We got in the car, sat there for a moment, and then I started emptying my pockets into my girlfriend's lap. We counted somewhere between 70 to 80 pounds in pure £1 coins. For a brief moment, we genuinely thought we were on a hidden camera prank show. The whole thing had been so surreal, but nothing ever came of it. We eventually figured that someone must have accidentally loaded both machines with rolls of £1 coins instead of 10p coins. Either way, it remains one of our all-time favorite stories to reminisce about. Yeah, I guess we were technically thieves, but it was magical. Story 12. During a particularly rough time in my life, post-divorce, drowning in debt, and barely scraping by paycheck to paycheck, I decided to cash in all my airline miles for a free solo trip to Vegas. I had astigmatism but couldn't afford corrective lenses, so before my trip, I went to an optical shop and got a free pair of sample contacts so I could take in the Strip in all its neon-lit glory. Big mistake. On my first day there, I scratched my right eye while putting in the lenses. By the next morning, it was agonizingly infected. A trip to the clinic confirmed the worst. I had developed a massive corneal ulcer that could permanently blind me in that eye. They gave me antibiotics, but the injury was severe enough that I needed multiple follow-ups. I had no insurance and no way to pay for this. The doctors were great, so I wasn't terrified of losing my eye, but the looming medical bills? Those would have wrecked me. Desperate, I went to the gift shop at Treasure Island and bought a toy pirate eye patch, skull and crossbones, of course, to cover my wounded eye. Then, I took the $20 in my pocket and went to work. I'm not much of a gambler, but I knew that video blackjack had the best odds. I started off slow, winning small amounts, only to have them wiped out by losses. Eventually, I was left with just $5. I took a walk to clear my head, came back, and promptly lost that $5 too. I was out of money. So, I logged into my bank's website, took out a $20 cash advance, and pulled it from the ATM. One last chance. And this time, things clicked. I managed to turn that $20 into over $500, enough to cover my medical bills. I stopped there. I knew better than to press my luck. Now, that toy eye patch hangs on my fridge, right next to a magnet from the ophthalmologist's office. A reminder of the time I gambled for mercy and won. Story 13. One time, I was flying from Long Beach, California, to Dulles, near DC. While waiting to board, I noticed a girl from my school. As a freshman in high school, I was pretty much in love with every girl I saw, but I had a special crush on this one, Annie. She was a cute little theater geek, one of the bubbliest and nicest people I had ever met. I wasn't the type to be afraid of talking to girls, so I went over and chatted with her while we waited. On the plane, though, she was seated all the way in the back, while I was right over the wing, so I didn't see her for the actual flight. Now, here's some important background. I am terrified of airplanes. I have to be able to see the horizon and the earth out the window at all times. If I can't, panic mode. I always book a window seat, gripping the armrest so tightly it's like I'm trying to fly the plane myself. After every flight, my arms and neck ache for days. Clouds? Anxiety. Night flights? Anxiety. Night flights with clouds? Pure, unfiltered hell. And this flight, it was at night and full of clouds. To make things worse, someone on the opposite side of the plane closed their window, so if we turned left, I couldn't see a damn thing. But then, the unthinkable happened. I had to go to the bathroom. I have literal nightmares about airplane bathrooms. No windows, no view of the horizon, just a tiny, claustrophobic box of pure terror. Still, nature called. I unbuckled, took a deep breath, and made my way to the bathroom. That's when the airborne collision avoidance system malfunctioned. For those who don't know, this is a system that uses radar to detect other planes. If it thinks there's a risk of collision, it automatically forces the plane into a dive to avoid a crash. Guess when it decided to malfunction? While I was peeing. The plane suddenly nosedived. I screamed in terror. To be fair, I wasn't the only one screaming. In my panic, I zipped up way too fast. I screamed again. This time, I was the only one screaming. The pilot quickly corrected the dive, and the plane leveled out. Meanwhile, I cleaned myself up, waited for the PA announcement explaining what had just happened, and snuck back to my seat while everyone else was still distracted. A few days later, I ran into Annie again. We casually mentioned the flight, talking about how wild that sudden dive was. Then she said, "Yeah, some guy was screaming in the bathroom. He just kept on screaming. It kind of creeped me out. She will never know it was me." Story 14. In my senior year of high school, I was part of a robotics team that won a regional competition in California, earning us a spot at the national competition in St. Louis, Missouri. 2 friends and I shared a hotel room, and we spent most of the night just hanging out and playing video games. Around 1 or 2 a.m., I decided I wasn't ready to call it a night. Even though we had a competition in the morning, I wanted to go explore the streets of St. Louis. The moment I opened the door, I heard a rip. Turns out, our chaperones had pulled the classic tape on the door trick to catch anyone sneaking out. Now, I was a pretty straight-edge kid in high school, didn't drink, didn't smoke, never got in trouble. But suddenly, at 2 a.m. in a hotel hallway, I was in full panic mode, convinced I was about to get kicked off the team or suspended. I woke one of my friends up and asked him what to do. He groggily brushed it off and went back to sleep. So, in my anxious, sleep-deprived state, I came up with a brilliant plan. I would remove the tape from every door on the entire floor. About halfway through, I started thinking, man, do we really have this many people on our team? But I was too deep into the mission to stop. By the time I was done, I had a massive wad of tape in my hands. I solid snaked my way through the hallway, hugging walls, peeking around corners, making sure I wasn't seen. Finally, I dumped the evidence into a planter and made my way downstairs. At this point, I was too exhausted to go outside, so I just hung around by the grand piano in the lobby. The next morning, everyone was confused about what happened to the tape. At breakfast, I overheard some people talking about it, and that's when I learned that there was another team, an all-girls team, staying on our floor. Apparently, they had gotten in trouble earlier for having a guy in their room before lights out. And now, since all the tape was gone, the blame fell on them. I felt horrible. So, I fessed up before they could get into serious trouble. Thankfully, the lobby guy vouched for me, confirming that I had been downstairs playing the piano the whole time. In the end, I didn't get in trouble, and the girls didn't either. But to this day, that's one of my favorite stories to tell. Story 15. This happened about 10 years ago. At the time, I lived in a small apartment with my future wife. The whole block was lined with 4 family flats, so we had tons of neighbors. One of them was an old man who lived on the 2nd floor of the building next to ours. We never learned his name, but we always knew when he was around. He was small and wiry, always wearing a scraggly short beard and some kind of veteran's cap. He spent his days storming back and forth in front of our apartments, chain smoking and randomly yelling. It was kind of sad, but also kind of amusing. One day, while we were out on our front porch, a silver Ford Focus came screeching to a halt right in front of our house. Windows down, radio blasting some detuned, half-static station at full volume. And inside, crazy old man, bobbing his head and yelling over the noise. Then, he put the car in park and floored the gas pedal for 5 straight minutes. After that, he hopped out, left the windows down, stormed around the car for a bit, then marched toward his door. Right before going inside, he stopped, looked directly at us, and yelled, "I just bought that with cash." Then he disappeared inside. We sat there, utterly WTFING, and laughed for an hour. And then, he did this every single day, at random intervals, for the next 3 months. Until one day he messed up his power slide into his usual spot and rear-ended some poor guy's car. The police got called, and when they arrived, they determined he wasn't drunk or under the influence, just completely insane. They didn't arrest him, but they told the gathered crowd to keep an eye on him. I think they gave him a ticket or something because after that, he stopped parking out front and started keeping the car in the carport behind the apartment. Then winter came. He stopped messing with the car entirely. It sat there, windows still down, slowly filling with snow. One day in January, we noticed his balcony door was slightly open. Not unusual, he rarely closed it. A few days later, an ambulance showed up and removed him. About a month after that, a new family moved in. The car was still sitting there in the carport. A couple of days later, the new family started driving it around. A few days after that, the apartment was back up for rent, and the car was never seen again. Story 16. I transferred groups within my company, and it was my first day in the new group. I arrived at my office, and my new bosses were outside smoking. I chatted with them for a bit, then headed up to my new desk. I was on the 9th floor, with my back to the window. I sat down, turned on my computer, and just a few seconds later, a massive explosion erupted behind me. The entire building shook. I ran to the window and saw debris floating through the air and birds flying chaotically. My first thought, car bomb. But looking down, I couldn't see anything that looked like an explosion site. After a few moments, I crouched down by my window and looked up. That's when I saw it. A gaping hole in World Trade Center 1. I was about 150 yards away at 222 Broadway, right across from St. Paul's Church, an unobstructed view. I just stood there, staring at the impact site. Then, the second explosion. The second plane hit. That's when it finally sank in. This wasn't random. I tried calling out, but all the lines were down. It was election day in NYC, so my grandmother was working at a polling station. My parents were on vacation in France. I eventually got through to my friend's dad and asked him to call my family and let them know I was okay. Then I looked back out the window and saw people jumping. That was, by far, the worst part. A little later, I managed to reach a friend on the phone. I was still talking to her when I saw one of the towers start to collapse. I screamed into the phone, "They're falling," threw it down, and ran for the stairwell. The last thing I heard was her voice on the receiver. "What's falling?" I made it into a sub-basement with a few others. Some people were in the server rooms, and others had run out into the street. We stayed there for a couple of hours, but then the building's AC system overloaded, and the room started filling with smoke and dust. I found some water, soaked my shirt, wrapped it around my face, and got the hell out. I started walking northeast, past City Hall Park, toward the bridges. The Brooklyn Bridge was covered in thick smoke, so I went toward the Manhattan Bridge with thousands of others. Halfway across, 2 military planes flew low over the bridge, and that was the first time I felt real terror. Everyone hit the deck. After I made it into Brooklyn, people were handing out bottled water. On one side of Flatbush Avenue, it was a church. On the other, a synagogue. It was a very New York moment. I found a school and used their landline to let someone know I was alive. Then I walked 2 more hours to get home. That evening, I got together with my friends, and we tried to get drunk. But it didn't work. We drank, but nobody felt it. The weight of everything was too much. The next morning, I finally got through to my parents. They had been trying to call NYC for almost 24 hours, but the lines were completely overwhelmed. For months, you could still smell the smoke, especially in the subways. It was shitty. Story 17. When I was about 8 years old, my dad decided that buying a boat would be the perfect way for us to spend quality family time together. We lived near Lake Lanier in Georgia and went to check out a 15-foot outboard ski boat. Simple, small, perfect for a beginner. Instead, my dad got man-shamed into buying a 30-foot cabin cruiser. Now, at this point, I had never seen either of my parents operate a boat, and as far as I could tell, neither had they. But that didn't stop them from telling anyone who would listen about our new boating lifestyle. Not knowing anything about boats, my dad got a slip at the nearest public marina. Nothing fancy, just a parking spot for the boat. Then came Biff. Biff was a friend of my parents and a proud member of the local yacht club. He invited us over to see if we wanted to join. My dad dodged the invite for as long as possible, partly because he was overwhelmed by the sheer size of the boat and partly because he had no business operating it in the first place. Eventually, though, he gave in. So one day, we set off across the lake to visit Biff at the yacht club, my dad at the helm, my mom's very drunk friend in tow, and none of us aware of the disaster we were about to unleash. The mooring buoy incident. When we arrived, my dad called Biff over the radio. Biff told us to tie up to a mooring buoy and wait for the launch to pick us up. Simple, right? Except now it was about 2 or 3 p.m., and my mom and her friend were completely plastered. My dad carefully maneuvered our 30-foot monstrosity between other boats, kids paddling in dinghies, and people just enjoying a peaceful day on the lake. Then my mom looked over the bow and slurred. How are we supposed to reach that? This was my dad's moment for revenge. After putting up with her and her drunk friend all day, he calmly replied, "Well, someone has to take that line, jump in, and tie it onto the buoy." Without hesitation, my mom grabbed the line, put it in her teeth, and jumped in. Just then, the yacht club launch arrived, carrying 2 very young, very confused guys who now had to figure out how to retrieve a very drunk woman wrestling with a mooring buoy. They eventually pulled her into the boat as gracefully as possible, avoiding any inappropriate contact. Still dripping wet, she looked up at them and asked, "So, did I do it right?" One of the guys replied, "That's one way to do it. But if you had a hook, you could have just pulled the buoy up to the boat." My mom, with absolute sincerity, "Oh, we have one of those." Chaos at the yacht club. We finally boarded the launch in a more traditional manner, and my dad, paranoid about leaving his new boat tied to a floating piece of rubber, decided to drop the anchor as extra protection. After a few forgettable hours at the yacht club, except for the banana hammock Biff insisted on wearing, my dad was itching to leave. We boarded the boat, started the engine, and got ready to head back. I was assigned 2 tasks. Untie us from the mooring buoy, easy enough. Pull up the anchor, disaster imminent. I couldn't budge the anchor. My dad, thinking I was just weak, told me to try harder. Then my mom and her drunk friend tried. Nothing. Finally, my dad tried. Not an inch. "Well, that's really stuck," he muttered. So, like any rational person, he decided to let the engine do the work. The great escape, almost. He pushed the throttle forward and drove over the anchor. Nothing. The boat snapped back like a dog hitting the end of a leash. Now everyone on their boats was watching. My dad, desperate to avoid further embarrassment, gave it more throttle. Again, the boat lunged forward, then slammed back into place. People were yelling. Dad, now fully panicking, floored it. That's when we finally broke free, with a loud pop, and started moving. Except something was very wrong. The engine was screaming. The boat was barely moving, and we were leaving a massive wake behind us. As my dad scanned the instrument panel, trying to diagnose the problem, my mom and I saw it first. We tried to tell him, but he was too distracted. Behind us, dragging through the bay like Quint's boat in Jaws, was 6 other boats. Our anchor line had snagged the mooring cable that held a chain of buoys, each one attached to a different boat. We had accidentally stolen an entire dock's worth of yachts. The people on those boats, screaming every obscenity imaginable. After realizing what was happening, my dad grabbed a knife and cut the anchor line. We sped off into the sunset, hoping to never be seen again. Biff's final words. As we rounded a point, the marine radio crackled to life. It was Biff. "Hey Bob, don't worry about joining the yacht club. In fact, if anyone asks, don't tell them you were here to visit me, okay? Story 18. I had a memory pop into my head recently, and honestly, it's a pretty good one. My elementary school had this annual event called Bike Rodeo. Every year, all the kids would bring their bikes, helmets, and elbow pads for a full day of riding obstacle courses, cruising around the playground, and competing in fun events. Bike rodeo was the absolute shit. Every year, I hyped myself up, telling my friends how I was going to dominate every single event. My balance, unmatched. My trash talk at recess, elite. There was just one problem. I didn't know how to ride a bike. I didn't actually learn until the summer after 6th grade. So, from 2nd to 5th grade, I had to pretend I had just forgotten my bike every year. Instead of riding, I had to walk the obstacle courses. Imagine the shame of doing challenges like walk backwards as slow as you can, touch all 4 corners, then you're done. It was humiliating, but I still loved bike rodeo. The vibes were just too good to miss out on. And hey, there were no clowns at bike rodeo. The relay race that ruined me. The final event of bike rodeo was a relay race. Each rider had to pedal 30 feet, sit on a balloon until it popped, race back, and tag the next person. I had always avoided this event because only 5 kids were selected per team, so it was easy to stay out of it. But in 5th grade, my luck ran out. Since I had spent years hyping myself up as a legendary bike rider, my classmates insisted that I participate. I tried to back out. Too late. Not only was I riding, but I had talked so much shit that I volunteered to be the anchor. I went all in. Save the best for last. If it's close, don't worry, I got it. The race wasn't close at all. We were bigger, stronger, and faster. By the time it was my turn, we had a full-person lead. I hopped on the bike, tried to mimic what everyone else had done, and took my first pedal. Immediately crashed to the right. Okay, must have been a fluke. Everyone was still cheering, so I got back on. Took another pedal, fell straight to the left. Oh no, I was now 5 feet into the race, had zero momentum, and was about to ruin everything. I peeked over. The 4th graders were catching up. Panic. I got back on the bike and proceeded to fall. 9 more times. My 5th grade teammates slowly stopped cheering. I can only imagine what they were saying. Is it the bike's fault? Is the chain off? Wait, does he not know how to ride a bike? Didn't he say he could do backflips on one? I finally made it to the balloon, sat down, and popped it on the first try, but by that point, I was shaken. While I struggled, the 3rd grade kid was already on his way back. Now it was a dead race between me and a 2nd grader. I gave it one last try. Surely, seeing all my friends watching, I could summon the magic to stay upright for just 30 feet. I couldn't. I ate it again. At this point, the teachers had started walking onto the track to clap for me. I was officially being pitted. I stood up, abandoned the bike, and sprinted to the finish line. It was like watching a boxer who needed the towel thrown in. I was Apollo Creed. The bike was that big Russian fuck. My last rodeo. I finally learned how to ride a bike the next year. But it was too late. There was no 6th grade bike rodeo, so I never got a chance to redeem myself. To this day, I sometimes think about orchestrating another bike rodeo, just to finally prove myself. Story 19. Late to the thread, but I've got a funny one. So, my ex was visiting town for a couple of days over the summer. We had broken up because she moved to another state, but we had already talked and both knew that this was our window to have a little action. This was the summer before my senior year, and I was still a virgin, so obviously, I needed to buy a condom, which I was super awkward about. Luckily, I had 2 of my best friends with me, so I presented them with my mission. I need a condom for tomorrow's activities with my ex. One of them immediately came up with a plan. Let's hit CVS. So we go? It closed 5 minutes ago. Damn it. The quest for condoms begins. Plan B, the convenience store. There was a 7-Eleven right across the street. Perfect. So we go? We spend 15 full minutes searching the store. Nothing. We looked everywhere, even checked the bathrooms. Apparently, this was the only convenience store in the world that didn't sell condoms. None of us wanted to ask the cashier out of fear of looking stupid and embarrassed, so we just left. By now, I was starting to panic. My entire summer highlight was riding on this. The last resort, Walmart. Desperate, we head to Walmart. And finally, we find them. Thank God. I was a little shocked by the variety, but picking one was easy. Then my friend Decker hits me with, "Hey bro, can you buy me some too?" At first, I was like, "Buy your own fucking condoms, man." But he was broke. They were like $3, and I'm too nice, so fine. I buy in the damn condoms. We head to self-checkout, thinking we can avoid human interaction, and they start shutting them down. The worst-case scenario. Now I have to face a cashier. A real, living person is about to judge me. I'm already a nervous wreck, so I refuse to make eye contact as I approach the register. And of course, just my luck, the cashier is an attractive woman in her early 20s. She scans the condoms, and in a kind but slightly awkward voice, she asks, "Are you ready?" Now, looking back, she probably thought I was really ambitious for buying 2 packs of condoms. But in my stupid, panic-stricken state, I repeat her words back to her. Except for some god-awful reason, I emphasize you. "Are you ready?" I immediately realize my mistake. I have just creeped her out. My friends, who were already dying watching me suffer, completely lose it. They're howling, barely able to contain themselves. I don't even care anymore. I just drop Decker's condoms at his feet, walk straight to my car, and let them laugh themselves sick all the way there. Looking back, it's hilarious. At the time, pure, unfiltered embarrassment. Story 20. I've been on this site for over 2 years and have never had the chance to tell my favorite story of all time. So, back in junior year of college, I was a resident assistant RA. Thankfully, all my residents got along great, except for Mike. Now, Mike wasn't a bad guy, but he was just odd. He never showered, or at least, it seemed like he didn't. He mostly communicated in grunts while staring at his shoes. His roommate, Dwayne, was the complete opposite. If you looked at him, you'd probably assume he was some alpha douche. He dressed the part. But in reality, he was one of the kindest, most genuine people I had ever met. He was even studying to work with special needs adults. The incident. One day, I stepped out of my room and saw Dwayne standing in the hallway, muttering to himself and shaking his head. I couldn't really make out what he was saying, but about 60% of it was swears, which was very unlike him. I walked up to him. "Hey, what's going on? You okay?" He sighed and shook his head. "It's Mike, man." I braced myself. "What happened?" Dwayne took a deep breath. "I heard a noise last night after we both went to bed, so I looked over, and he's jerking off." I fought the urge to laugh, put on my serious RA face, and nodded. "That's messed up. I can talk to him, or we can have my boss call him into the office." Dwayne just stared at me, his jaw clenched, and then he said, "That's not the bad part, man." When he finished, he partook. I blinked. "You what?" For some reason, my brain refused to understand what that meant. Dwayne saw my confusion. So, in the calmest, quietest voice possible, he clarified. "Like Winnie the Pooh, man. Lick that shit off like it was honey." Now, before you become an RA at my school, you go through 2 full weeks of training. They prepare you for everything. Handling sexual assault cases, dealing with fights, mental health emergencies, how to order chicken wings for a dorm event. At no point in those 2 weeks do they tell you what to do when a grown man eats his own cum in front of his roommate. A decision to make. I told Dwayne that we could go straight to my director, and I would personally advocate for him to get Mike suspended. At the very least, get them separate rooms. Dwayne took a deep breath. A long, slow, sad breath. Then he declined. "If I move out, or if he gets kicked out, someone else is going to have to deal with him. Someone less equipped to handle his difficulties. I can't do that." He sighed. "This is a teachable moment. I'm going to try to help him with what I've learned in my classes. Faith in humanity, destroyed and rebuilt." And that was the day that my faith in humanity was shattered and then rebuilt in 5 minutes. Story 21. Guys, this thread is a goldmine of road trip stories, so here's mine. A couple of years ago, during my Erasmus studies, 3 friends and I decided to go on a road trip to Spain. We were well prepared, sleeping bags, tents, a portable grill, everything we'd need in case of an unplanned stop. The trip was supposed to last 1 week. But, as you can probably guess, something went wrong. The Bridge of Doom. On the first day, after 5 hours in the car, we decided to stop in a tiny French town in the Pyrenees to grab some food before continuing to San Sebastian. It was late, but 2 of my friends decided to explore a bit. They came back excited, saying they had found the remains of a medieval drawbridge, except the bridge just ended in the middle of a river. Naturally, our driver and passenger bolted ahead to check it out, while I lagged behind. By the time I got there, it was already dark, and what I saw was baffling. The driver looked as white as marble. The passenger was laughing uncontrollably. Turns out, while admiring the view, the driver leaned over, and the car keys slipped out of his shirt pocket, straight into the river. The situation, absolute disaster mode. All of our stuff, tents, food, everything, was locked inside the car. It was pitch black, in a tiny town where everyone was asleep. We were in the Pyrenees in March, freezing. We had no choice. The three of us took turns swimming in the river, one person diving while the others held onto them so they wouldn't get swept away by the strong current. The water was freezing, the river was deep, and after several attempts, we had to admit defeat. The unexpected rescuer. Meanwhile, our fourth friend had gone knocking on doors, hoping to find help. Somehow, he found a guy living right next to the bridge. The guy was extremely welcoming. He had just bought a huge house a week ago and was restoring it to turn it into a hotel. He insisted that we stay with him for the night and look for the keys in the morning. And this wasn't just any hospitality. This man went all out. Each of us got our own room, complete with a big bed, fresh towels, and toothbrushes. He served us an amazing supper with boar meat and wine. It was better than any hotel we had planned to stay in. The next day, victory. In the morning, we went back to the river. And somehow, we actually found the keys. Since our unexpected host had been so generous, we decided to spend the whole day helping him with his restoration work. Instead of rushing off, we took our time, enjoyed a beautiful day in the Pyrenees, and made a new friend for life. Moral of the story? Sometimes, the best road trip memories come from things going horribly wrong. Story 22. It was 9 p.m. on a Wednesday night in Lubbock, Texas. The year was 2004. I was hanging out in my apartment with my roommates when a couple of our friends showed up, a little buzzed, carrying whiskey. We put on some music, and a song about Mexico came on. And that was all it took. By 10:30 p.m., three of us had made the completely rational decision to drive 5.5 hours to Mexico. I hadn't been drinking, so I offered to drive. The spontaneous road trip expands. Before we left, my friend said, swing by Cricket's, a local bar, to see if another friend wanted to join. We got to the bar, found him, and, of course, he was in. But, naturally, they had to have a few more drinks before we left. So now it's 12:30 a.m. As we're walking out, my friend spots two girls in the parking lot and casually asks, "Hey, we're going to Mexico. Y'all want to come?" And for some ungodly reason, they said yes. So now, 6 of us piled into my Ford Explorer and set off for the border. We hadn't even made it out of the city limits before. One guy and one girl climbed into the trunk and passed out. The other 3 stayed up for a while, but eventually knocked out too. That left me, completely sober, completely alone, driving through the night. The Lamb Convention and the first crisis. By 5:30 a.m., I couldn't go any further. I pulled into a hotel 30 minutes from the border, hoping to get a room. I walked up to the front desk, exhausted, and asked for a room. The guy at the desk laughed in my face. "Don't you know there's a Lamb Convention in town?" "A Lamb Convention? Of course." So now I was beyond done. Luckily, one of the guys woke up and offered to drive the rest of the way to Del Rio, where we could at least get a hotel on the American side and grab a few hours of sleep. The girls have a realization. We finally found a hotel in Del Rio, passed out until noon, and then piled back into the car to find a place to park before crossing the border. And that's when the girls finally realized where we were. Girl 1. "Wait, where are we?" Girl 2. "I thought we were going to New Mexico." After we explained that this was actual Mexico, they had very different reactions. One was thrilled and proud of herself for doing something so spontaneous. The other immediately threw up. Mexico and the ATM incident. By 12:30 p.m., we were in Mexico, eating lunch, drinking margaritas, and making bad decisions. Fast forward to 4 p.m., we were all completely loaded. Except for the girl who threw up earlier, who had sworn off drinking. We were out of money, so I went to an ATM. Turns out, it was in pesos, not dollars. It took me 5 separate transactions to withdraw the equivalent of $100. This, of course, triggered fraud alerts. At the same time, a local started hanging around us. Someone told me he was probably planning to jump me. One of my less drunk friends suggested we head back. But I was like, hell no, I have $100 in pesos. So we went back to the bar, Ma Crosby's, where we had started, and pounded margaritas until we were out of money again. Things get fuzzy. I remember 2 guys dancing with old ladies, a table being broken, one of us losing his ID, which made crossing the border difficult. My brilliant attempt to solve this problem by yelling at border guards. I was student body president. Why I thought that would help, I have no idea. Teleportation back to Lubbock. The next memory I have is someone in the car saying, "Take a right on 4th. We were back in Lubbock. It was 10 p.m. on Thursday. No memory of the ride back. It was like we teleported. The aftermath. I woke up to 20 missed calls and voicemails from my parents. Turns out, if you make 5 back-to-back ATM withdrawals in Mexico, your bank calls your parents. I called them back. They were just happy I was alive and that I hadn't been arrested. The next morning, one of my friends came over to pick up his truck. I had just started watching Lonesome Dove, a 6-hour miniseries. He sat down and said, "I'll watch a little bit of it." We didn't move for 6 hours. And that was the perfect ending to one of my favorite stories. Story 23. When I was a kid, I went to a private Catholic school for elementary and middle school. Now, everyone knows these places are supposed to provide a great education, good life skills, and discipline. And in the long run, they did. I wouldn't trade it for the world. Except for one day in 3rd grade. I'm changing names, mainly because I don't remember most of the people. The rise of Cat Mouse Town. My 3rd grade teacher, Mrs. A, was probably going through some shit. Most of the time, instead of teaching, she just let us play with blocks in the back of the room. And honestly, it was awesome. I spent my days constructing an entire city out of these blocks. I had little cat and mouse figurines as the citizens. Cat Mouse Town was thriving. A few of my friends helped build it, and together we created a utopia. Except for one little prick. Let's call him Tony. Tony was that asshole kid. The one who ruins everything. He was obsessed with building his own tower, which was shitty. And trust me, I knew architecture. But instead of working on his own thing, he kept trying to steal blocks from my town. Most days, I was there to stop him. I had a mega stadium under construction, and I wasn't about to let this 2-bit scavenger ruin my booming metropolis. But then, one fateful day, Mrs. A threw everything into chaos. The secret mission. That morning, Mrs. A seemed a little off, kind of stumbly. Nobody really cared, though. She just let us play with blocks all day, which was a win in my book. While I was expanding Cat Mouse Town, she called me up to her desk. Her coffee smelled weird, like the communion wine, but different. She handed me her car keys and said, "Go to my car and get my coffee. But don't tell anyone. It's a secret, and I know you're a good secret keeper." Hell yeah, I was a good secret keeper. Probably the best in class. I put on my coat, told my friend to keep an eye on Tony, and headed for the side door like she told me. But there was one problem. The locked door dilemma. The door was locked. I panicked. How the hell was I supposed to get her coffee now? Who can open a locked door? And then it hit me. The principal. Surely, the principal could unlock the door for me. So, in my infinite 3rd grade wisdom, I walked straight to the principal's office and said, "I need to go outside." Naturally, the principal asked why. And because I was a good secret keeper, I said, "I can't tell you, but it's a good secret." That was not the right answer. The downfall of Mrs. A and Cat Mouse Town. Instead of unlocking the door, the principal walked me back to class. When we got there, Mrs. A did not look happy. Next thing I knew, she was gone, and a teacher from across the hall came in to watch us. But honestly, I didn't care, because when I got back to Cat Mouse Town, it was in ruins. Tony had pillaged my city. Apparently, he had bribed my friend with candy, and my so-called loyal ally had abandoned his post to go color. I was betrayed, and there was Tony, standing there, grinning like a little shit, building his shitty-ass tower on top of my demolished civilization. So, in an act of pure justice, I did the only logical thing. I walked over and kicked his tower over. Tony cried. I got in trouble for bullying, keeping secrets. The aftermath. I was banned from blocks for a week. Cat Mouse Town was never rebuilt. I was forced to spend my free time drawing crayon circles. As for Mrs. A, she wasn't fired, but she was moved to the special needs department, a department that had no students. So, she basically just sat in the library, tutoring 1 or 2 kids who needed extra help. Honestly, she was nice. I'm glad one bad day didn't ruin her career. But damn, I wish I had rebuilt Cat Mouse Town. That was my crowning achievement of 3rd grade. Story 24. When I was 16, I worked at McDonald's. I was your typical stoner late-night worker, closing shifts, greasy uniform, just trying to make it through. Every night after work, my friend and I would hit up a pool hall. Now, I had the pleasure of driving my brother's truck, a half-ton Chevy spray-painted black, with a 4-inch lift and mudding tires. I loved that truck. I wasn't a huge redneck, just a white kid who liked weed. But this truck definitely had some redneck quirks. For example, the manual window cranks were missing, so we had to use a single pair of vice grips to roll the windows up and down. The setup. That night, my friend Jack and I had just gotten paid, which meant one thing. Weed. Lots of weed. Jack pulled out this 3-chamber bowl, and let me tell you, this thing was a masterpiece. He packed at least an eighth into the chambers and loaded the bowl. Dude was so proud. He held it up for a second to admire his work, then sparked it up. Bam! Lights start flashing behind me. Whoop whoop. Instant panic mode. Shit, dude, get rid of it. Jack tosses the bowl under the bench seat, then frantically waves for the vice grips to roll down the window and clear the smoke. Except, he drops the pliers. At this point, I'm like fuck it and pull over. The cop and the window situation. It's 1 a.m. Cold as hell. I'm in my grease-stained work shirt, just 1 week after swearing into the delayed entry military program, and I'm thinking my future is dead. The cop floods the truck with his spotlight. Panic sets in. Then, I realize, shit, the window. I turn to Jack. Give me the pliers. He shrugs. Doesn't have them. So I crack open the door. Bad move. Over the loudspeaker. Turn off the vehicle and shut the door now. I shut the truck off and slam the door. At that moment, a second cop car pulls up behind us. Jack groans. The first cop knocks on my window and motions for me to roll it down. I just shake my head and yell. I can't. It's broken. So he tells me to get out of the truck and walk to the tailgate. Jack fumbles the bag. I'm standing in the freezing cold, trying to talk my way out of it. I start rambling about how I'm joining the military, pointing at my greasy McDonald's shirt for sympathy, and telling them we were just heading to play pool with some friends. Out of the corner of my eye, I see the other cop moving toward Jack's door. Now, let me tell you something about Jack. Jack does not do well under pressure. I know this. So I start talking louder, saying something like, "You do not have permission to search my truck." No idea what I thought that would accomplish. The cop tries to get Jack to roll down his window. Obviously, that's not happening. So the cop opens the door instead. And at that exact moment, an empty beer can tumbles out onto the ground. Another lovely redneck addition courtesy of my brother. The cop's flashlight follows the can. Jack's face goes pale. Then, the cop shines his light on Jack's shirt. And it's covered in weed shake. Cop, what's that? Jack, panicked, tries to brush it off. Cop, stop. That's evidence. The search and the deal. They move us to the curb and start searching the truck. Jack and I both know. We're fucked. While sitting there, I notice the truck's headlights are still on. So, naturally, I yell over to the cops. Hey, can you turn off my lights? And they actually do it. At this point, I've accepted my fate. I just want this night to be over. Then, the cop leans into the truck and pulls out the bowl. Jack's eyes go wide like he just got punched in the gut. The cops start talking to each other, pointing at us. The older cop walks over and holds out the bowl. Whose is this? Jack raises his hand. Then the cop says, if you take this bowl, stomp it into the ground, and kick it into that drain. He shines his flashlight at a storm drain. We'll let you go. I couldn't believe it. And then, Jack looks the cop dead in the eye and says, no. I stood there, mouth open, staring at Jack like he had just thrown away our one chance at freedom. The cop turned to me. I held out my hand. Jack looked at me like I had betrayed him. I took the bowl, tossed it down, and stomped on it. And let me tell you, that thing would not break. I had to jump on it to finally shatter it. Jack looked like he was about to murder me on the spot. Okay, kick it in the drain. I kicked it in. The cop nodded. Go straight home, boys. And that was that. The final twist. We got back in the truck. Jack hadn't said a word to me. I was mumbling about the bowl, staring at the rearview mirror, watching the cops drive away. Then I turned the key. The truck wouldn't start. The damn lights had drained the battery. I got out, ran after the last cop car, and asked for a jump. He actually did it. Then he waved and said, go straight home. We pulled away, and I finally turned to Jack. He was grinning. I sighed. What's so funny? He pulled out the ashtray, pointed, and said, half a joint. There it was, still sitting there in the ashtray. He lit it up. Then we drove to the pool hall. Story 25. Oh, this is a good one. One summer, I was working geophysics in the mountains of Idaho. The only woman in our field party, Helen, had never driven a large, manual transmission truck, which the rough terrain demanded. Unlike me, she was willing to try. There was a lot of tricky business with clutching, shifting, and, oh yes, one small but critical detail: setting the handbrake when parked on a hill. Seems minor, right? Well, that one detail became the entire story. The scene at the diner. We were sitting in a diner, enjoying a meal, when we looked up and saw it. Our truck, rolling backward, right toward a pickup truck parked behind it. There was nothing we could do. We just watched in horror as our lifted truck crumpled the poor pickup's front end. Now, under normal crash conditions, that pickup might have survived, but our truck had a raised suspension, which meant our bumper was perfectly aligned with its headlights. Destruction ensued. Enter the cowboy. The second the crash happened, Helen shot up from her chair and rushed for the door. The rest of us started to follow, but she waved us off. She didn't tolerate interference. So we sat, we ate, and we watched. Through the glass, we saw her circling the wreckage, inspecting it like a hummingbird, muttering what we could only assume was a truly creative string of expletives. And then he emerged, the owner of the destroyed pickup truck. Tall hat, wide brim, kerchief for a necktie. He did not walk. He moseyed. Cue tumbleweed. Cue mournful harmonica. The offer. He reached the scene, and she turned to face him. He was standing on the remains of his turn signal, just shattered pieces of orange plastic beneath his boots. Our truck, completely unscathed. Now, at this point, things could have gone bad. But instead, he removed his hat with one hand and held out a small bouquet of flowers with the other. Helen saw the flowers. Her eyes went wide. That's when the trouble started. The storm. Time slowed. The cowboy stood frozen, like a man who had just pulled the pin on a grenade and realized his mistake too late. Then, she let him have it. She became a hurricane, blowing only in his direction. He was hit with waves of invective, driven by her gale force rage. She snatched the flowers and threw them in the gutter. Her arms flailed, her voice rose, and her hands spoke their own language. Hands on head, hands held high, hands on hips. No single pose could fully convey her fury. She jabbed a finger right under his nose. He glanced at it. Then he grinned. She redoubled her efforts. The aftermath. At long last, she ran out of breath. She stood there, hands on her hips, catching herself. A group of the cowboy's friends had gathered to watch his misfortune. When her tirade finally stopped, they began to chuckle. She glanced their way. Silence. She turned back to the cowboy. He stared right back. She shifted her weight, crossed her arms, and raised an eyebrow. A silent challenge. Your move, cowboy. We held our breath. With slow deliberation, the cowboy replaced his hat, tugging at the brim in a quiet salute. And then, to our utter amazement, she almost smiled. He turned, took a long, slow step back, then another. His friends parted ranks to let him pass. Not one of them met his eye, and just like that, he was gone. Cue sunset. Reprise harmonica. Fade to black. Back at the table, Helen walked back into the diner as if nothing had happened. She picked at her salad, humming softly between forkfuls. We, meanwhile, kept our heads down, eating as quietly as possible, trying not to make a single sound with our cutlery. At one point, Joel almost asked her for the salt. I kicked him under the table. Reflections. Helen saw the flowers as patronizing, but honestly, I felt a little sorry for the cowboy. I think his intentions were good. She was a perfectionist, and her mistake with the brake had probably put her close to tears, not because she feared confrontation, but because she was furious with herself. The cowboy misread the situation. He thought she needed comfort. Instead, he got annihilated. The lingering mystery. I still wonder, where did the cowboy get those flowers? I suspect he stole them from a window box planter. If so, at least that particular crime came with its own punishment. As for where he went, no clue. When we passed through town again, his pickup had been towed. We never saw him again. Story 26. The year was 2003, and I was a senior in high school. Every day, a bunch of my friends and I would play hacky sack in the lunchroom, which was right next to the special needs wing. After a few days of watching from a distance, one student, Franklin, finally joined us. Franklin lacked the motor skills to keep up with the rest of the group, so some friends and I started a second circle, just for him. We weren't hardcore about the game anyway. We were mostly chatting and having fun, So we didn't mind that Franklin rarely connected with the foot bag, and when he did, it usually went flying. What mattered was that he was enjoying himself. I don't know what Franklin's exact condition was, but he had difficulty communicating beyond grunts and gestures. He wore thick glasses, was a bit overweight, and, while it's not particularly important to the story, he was also black. The hacky sack group? All white kids. No big surprise, given the demographics of our school. The incident. One day, I walked into the lunchroom and saw Franklin standing alone, tossing a foot bag into the air and kicking at it. I figured he had told his parents about his new hobby, and they got him his own hacky sack. I went to grab some food, then headed back to meet my friends. That's when I saw them. 3 huge guys walked up to Franklin, shoved him to the ground, and took his hacky sack. Then, laughing, they walked over to a row of lockers and tossed it on top, hopelessly out of his reach. Now, I'm not the type to get involved. I usually mind my own business. But this was too much. Franklin never bothered anyone. He was just a kid trying to have fun, and these guys decided he was their personal punching bag. I walked straight up between them, grabbed the hacky sack off the lockers, and handed it back to Franklin. Then I looked them right in the eye and said, "You should be ashamed of yourselves." Franklin instantly brightened up. The guys? They just glared at me. Franklin's mom and the fallout. Before I could even walk away, a woman approached me. She introduced herself as Franklin's mom and said she had seen the whole thing. She thanked me over and over. I smiled and told her, "Your son is a good kid. People picking on those who are different? I can't stand that." She gave me a hug, and we parted ways. The bell rang. Suddenly, I was surrounded. The guys who had pushed Franklin? They had brought backup. I tried to talk my way out of it, but every reasonable response was met with, "Ugh, what now, tough guy?" A flood of curses. At first, I thought, well, if they haven't hit me yet, they probably won't. So I just kept walking. But then I realized, the 3 guys had become 10. And as I kept walking, more people joined the mob. By the time I reached the security office, there were 20 or more. I tried to duck inside, but a few guys blocked the door, forcing me to keep moving. The escape plan. At this point, I knew I was about to get my ass beat. And the only thing I could think of that might save me? Rednecks. The metal/woodshop lockers were just ahead, where all the rough country kids hung out. I ran right to them, turned, and shouted, "Hey, look at this." The rednecks turned, saw the crowd behind me, and immediately squared up. Chest puffed out, fists clenched, ready for a fight. Suddenly, the mob stopped advancing. The school resource officer appeared in the hallway, pepper spray at the ready. Then the second bell rang, signaling that everyone was now late for class. The crowd dispersed. The realization. Until that day, I was the kind of person who didn't think about race much. I always figured that being a good person was enough, that everyone thought the same way I did. But after this, I realized that not everyone does, and that assuming they do can have real consequences. Had I been someone else, in a different situation, this might have played out very differently. Because people don't always see the world the same way you do, and thinking they do, that can get you hurt. Story 27. I single-handedly uncovered and foiled a plot to firebomb a hotel and murder 2 people. Years ago, I got a call from a girl I'd been dating. Let's call her Navina. She had a damned cute Indian accent. My father is acting very strange. I am worried about him. He is so dark and moody lately, and I think something bad has happened with him. What has he done that's strange? He's making odd requests. He asked for a key to my apartment and told me not to tell anyone. He then ordered me to store some boxes in my closet, but I am not allowed to look inside them. And he bought a black wig and wants me to give him a haircut while he's wearing it. I am afraid he is planning something bad. I told her she should just open the boxes, but she refused. She said an Indian girl cannot defy her father. So I hopped in the car and made a long-ass drive to go see her. I opened the first box. It contained a complete set of men's work clothes, overalls, gloves, etc., and a huge, shaggy black wig. Odd, but not scary. The second box contained about 10 empty plastic 2-liter Pepsi bottles and a box of bullets. At this point, my heart began to race a bit. The next box was filled with a plastic trash bag stuffed with styrofoam packing peanuts and a gas can. What the fuck? I muttered to myself and sat down to Google, or whatever search engine existed before Google, what you could do with gasoline and packing peanuts. The answer was alarming. Napalm? I explained to Navina that her father might indeed be planning something bad. Who would your father want to kill? She explained that he had been obsessing for years over the fact that his wife was good friends with a man who ran a small hotel. He was convinced they were having an affair. He had tried to catch them in the act before, but never succeeded. It didn't help that the mother in this case was a terrible harpy, overly critical of him and notoriously unkind. Navina didn't know if an affair was actually happening, but it seemed possible. Well, your father has snapped, I told her. He's going to kill someone and burn something down to hide the evidence. We both agreed that the hotel manager was the likely target. I told her to confront him, and she freaked out. Never. I cannot do that. I do not tell him what to do. I listen to him and do what he tells me. Well, I don't, I said, and took all the crap in the boxes to my truck. I had Navina explain to the apartment manager that her key had been stolen and that she needed her lock changed. Then I walked down to the corner store and called the cops from a payphone. I explained that I had just uncovered a murder bomb plot, but that no one had been hurt and no crime had been committed yet. The cops said no one would be arrested, but that I should wait right there so they could come talk to me. I said no. I'm hanging up now. Thank you. But am I legally required to turn this man in? I asked. They said no. So I hung up and skedaddled. Back at the apartment, I explained to Navina, who was already a convicted felon, another long story, that if her father committed a crime with her help, she was going to be nailed to the fucking wall. No one would shed a tear over a mother-killing, foreign-born accomplice with a criminal record. I convinced her to confront her father. She called him and told him she had opened the boxes and knew he was planning to kill her mother and the hotel manager. There was a long pause. Finally, he said, "It was a stupid idea anyway," and hung up the phone. Obviously, the only thing left to do at that point was fuck her, so I did. Then I took all the crap home. As I was entering my own apartment, I ran into a little street girl I had befriended a few months earlier. She was crying because her mom had gotten mad and thrown away her Halloween outfit. "Merry Halloween," I said, handing her old clothes that were way too big and an enormous black wig. She squealed with joy. My neighbor happily took the bullets. "This is what I shoot, man." "Cool." My other neighbor happened to need a gas can, and I, myself, used the packing peanuts when I moved later on. It felt good to repurpose someone else's murder kit. Story 28. I was raised Baptist in Greenville, Maine. I always tried so hard to fit in, but never could. I thought of myself as weird because I shopped at thrift stores. This was before it was cool. We were poor. Religion was my whole life, yet I didn't fit in there either. I was conflicted. I said the sinner's prayer so many times, hoping it would eventually make me feel saved. I never even questioned, saved from what? I didn't deconvert until I was 35. Between 18 and 35, I ignored religion but never did anything about it, except feel guilty. Everyone knew drinking was wrong. My dad had drunk in the army before he became a Christian or a pastor. He always talked about it to give himself sin credit, so he could say to people, "I've done far worse things than you, and God saved me." I remember the first time someone had an Odal's non-alcoholic beer. I was scandalized. Relatives would leave recyclables around that reeked of beer, and I judged their sin. My first drink was on my 21st birthday, a single glass of wine. I read anything I liked. G.I. Joe comics, Spider-Man, sci-fi, fantasy. I read all the Hardy Boys. I read the Picture Bible, a comic book Bible. I read James Michener and Leon Uris for school. I played in the woods behind my house. I cut swords from pieces of wood and swung them at trees. I had a nice hammer. I built a fort and put my G.I. Joe comics inside, where they rotted. I mostly played by myself. I rode the bus sometimes, but other times I walked. Either way, I read the entire way. I carried a trombone, which made it an effort to fit into the bus or walk. The best thing was on the coldest days in February when my dad would cruise up and take us to school. I had open access to a flying service where my mom worked. Once, I pushed logs into the water and stopped both airplane and boat traffic in the whole bay at Moosehead. We had to take the rowboat out and pull in all the logs as punishment. There were so many, it took the rest of the day. My dad tells these stories that aren't funny. He often tells women they have mustaches, and when they get embarrassed, he follows up with a story about a girl 20 years ago who had a mustache, and how he told her, and her face turned red. I'm always mortified when he tells that joke. It isn't funny. My family has Saturday night supper every week. It's a New England tradition to have beans and hot dogs on Saturday night. It's been ongoing to this day. Bring a dish, beans, hot dogs, coleslaw, rolls, zucchini relish, and, in recent years, macaroni and cheese for the kids. Every holiday and Christmas was spent at my father's parents' house. We called them grandfather and grandmother and never thought it was strange. I still have 3 phone numbers memorized from my childhood. 368-5707 was my first number until 3rd grade. 695-3069 was my second number until I graduated. 695-3744 was my first girlfriend's number. We lived in a rented house that belonged to Rolly Babin, which we called the Rolly Babin house, and still do. It had a cone on the porch roof, so it was probably Victorian era. I got the bedroom without a radiator, and if I wanted the privacy of a shut door, there was often ice in my water come morning. We had television sporadically as kids, but my dad would cancel it whenever he felt guilty about letting it control his life. His definition of that was watching back-to-back MASH reruns every night after dinner. He felt addicted after 2 shows a night. We heated with wood or oil, but since wood was cheaper, we used that first. In a strange sexist turn of events, I had to split, stack, and haul the wood. My sisters didn't. Sexism. Mow the lawn, me. Take out the garbage, me. Shovel snow, me. Feed, water, and shovel shit for the horse, me. Rake leaves, me. Dishes, laundry, clean bathrooms, my 2 sisters and me. I never questioned it. That's just what boys do. Did I mention we were poor? One time, we were so poor that my mother asked a family friend with an egg farm for a deal, and we got 5 dozen eggs, 2 flats, for free. That was all we had to eat for a week. One time, we were so poor that my mother went to the grocery store and saw blocks of cheese being thrown out because of mold. She convinced the guy to give them to her for free. She cut off the mold, and we had cheese omelets. We felt rich that night. We were so poor that my mother made our clothes, until I got embarrassed and switched to thrift store clothes. She made us backpacks for school. I was 35 before I realized I didn't want my mother to give me t-shirts with slogans for Christmas. I wanted homemade clothes again. Homemade stuff is the best, and my mother is the best at it. We were so poor that my parents have a lot of miracle stories. They'd be unable to pay a bill for exactly $123.45, and then someone would stop by with a check for exactly $123.45. The amount was always different, but the miracle was always the same. We always had cats. Sometimes we had dogs. Why did we have them if we were so poor? Our town didn't have a pound for stray animals, so the police would pick them up and kill them the next day. My parents were the kindest people, so they'd stop by the police station, take the animals, and find them new homes, or keep them in ours. We were so poor that one time we got a rabbit from the police station. We ate rabbit stew. My dad was in the army, and patriotism colored all aspects of our lives. I joined the Navy at 19. I didn't do it for duty, but I'm happy to pretend. Story 29. Random but true story. My brother, sister, and I were in California visiting family. While in LA, we decided to do one of the Starlene Hollywood home tours. During the tour, my sister struck up a casual conversation with a guy and his girlfriend. He casually mentioned that his home might be on the tour, and she just assumed that as we made our way through Beverly Hills, we might pass by his house. Anyway, when we reached Beverly Hills, he leaned forward and spoke to the tour operator, mentioning that one of the mansions was his and that we could drive in if we wanted. He triggered the gate, and we drove in. It turned out to be a massive, well-known estate. At the end of the driveway, the tour operator asked if she could step out and take a picture, since this had never happened before. The guy then offered to give us a tour of the house, which we obviously accepted. As we entered, security came running, but he just laughed and explained that he was having fun on the tour. The house and the grounds were absolutely unbelievable. After we left, my sister continued chatting with him. She mentioned that while we were in front of David Spade's house, he had been texting Spade to let him know he was outside. Apparently, the guy had lived in the area for years but didn't know much about the surrounding houses and was showing his girlfriend around Beverly Hills. While still on the tour, my sister asked if he had any recommendations for a place to have dinner to get the Hollywood experience. He offered to get us a reservation at Koi. This was early 2009. After the tour ended, we thanked him and said our goodbyes. As we were asking the tour operator how much an average bill at Koi would be, the guy came back and handed us his cell number in case we had any problems. The tour operator mentioned that we were wondering about the cost, to which he simply replied, "Don't worry, you're on my tab." After dinner, We texted him a thank you message. He knew we might be in another city later that week where he also had a mansion and replied that if we wanted to visit, we should let him know. His staff would prepare us a dinner. He mentioned that it was his favorite house, which he mostly used for entertaining. Of course, we took him up on the offer. When we arrived, we checked in with security and were buzzed through the gate. The place was stunning. We were greeted by the house manager, who welcomed us and mentioned that we'd be having a seafood dinner since we'd be eating overlooking the ocean. While waiting for lunch to be prepared, we were offered swimsuits in case we wanted to go for a swim. They then gave us a tour of the house. It was insane. So many things were imported from monasteries, and one area had a hand-painted ceiling that the artist had spent 6 months preparing for. The house had all the typical billionaire luxuries: bowling alley, private theater with pre-release movies, and more. When dinner was served, we had 1 or 2 guys waiting on us. It was incredible. One of the dishes was crab legs, which were pre-cracked so we wouldn't have to work at them. If even that was too much effort, there was a bowl of freshly pulled crab meat right beside them. You get the idea. Insane. Smiley face. We didn't have time to swim since I was about to fly to New Zealand and Australia for a 3-week trip. And Australia was amazing, but honestly, this experience was hard to beat. Really grateful for his generosity. Story 30. Should I tell you about love? Those are always the best stories. She was gorgeous, to be honest. If she had her hair down, I usually couldn't even complete a sentence. She'd smile at that, which only made my problem worse. My God, that smile. Easily her best feature. When I met her, she had braces, somehow, that only made it even more amazing. We met in French class in college. It quickly became clear that we were the only ones in class with any common interests, so before long, she started sitting next to me. We would talk on Facebook a lot. I used to call her Green Dot. I don't know why. We talked about Skyrim, movies, books, TV shows, video games, God, Jesus. Sometimes, after the next semester when we were no longer in the same class, we would accidentally bump into each other on the way from one class to another. I timed it. I found out later, she did too. Over the summer, we Skyped a lot, and I couldn't help but tell her how pretty she was. Just sitting there. No makeup. Ever. No jewelry. Nothing. She asked if I liked her. I said yes. She said, I like you too. But then she said, but I still love my boyfriend. They broke up, and she stopped liking me. I never knew why. I fell for her. Hard. Still do. We still talk. But God, I miss those days. There's more cute stuff to tell, but time is short. Story 31. I was a waitress at a privately owned restaurant. The owners had a policy. If someone walked out on their bill, it was the waitress's fault for not keeping a close enough eye on them. About 2 years in, I had my first dine-and-dasher. That night, I was the only waitress on shift, covering about 17 tables. It wasn't too bad. Most customers came for the interaction, and I knew a lot of them personally. Then he walked in. Big guy, kind of frumpy, pushing 6 feet 2 inches. Possibly wearing gang colors, but he looked clean. New hat, new shoes, some decent bling. He ordered nachos and a few beers, and his tab climbed to just over $60. Then he got up and left. Now, I don't know what the goddamn fuck I was thinking, but I ran after him. He was clumsy and slow. I was short, 5 feet tall, and quick. I caught up to him easily. We were literally on Main Street. Cars driving by, people walking on the sidewalk. I grabbed his arm, made him face me, and asked, "Are you going to pay for that?" He actually turned the pockets of his basketball shorts inside out and told me I could pat him down if I wanted. He explained that he didn't even have a wallet on him. I told him, "I ain't gonna touch you, but if you walk out on your bill, it comes out of my pocket." I said that on purpose. 1, because I think other people are dirty. 2, because if it came down to a fight, I knew I couldn't handle close-range combat with someone that much bigger than me. I'm a quick runner, but not a fighter. He actually looked genuinely sorry. I sized him up and thought about taking his shoes as collateral, but decided it'd be too much of a hassle. "Give me your hat, then," I said. So he took it off and handed it to me. At this point, I was thinking the hat probably wasn't worth much, so I held it by the rim and told him, "Put your bracelet and necklace in here too. You can come pick them up at the restaurant when you're ready to pay your bill." As we parted ways, a passerby walked up to me and asked if the guy had been giving me trouble. Then he pulled out his ID and said he was a plainclothes officer. Crap, that's when I realized. It looked like I had just mugged this big dude. I quickly explained that the guy had walked out on his bill, didn't have a wallet, and had voluntarily given me collateral. I went back into the restaurant, now carrying the guy's bling. Inside, everything was still running smoothly. Customers were behaving. Some of my friends looked at me in amazement and even clapped. Totally unnecessary, but okay, LOL. So that's my story. Badass dude walks out on his bill. I walk away with his swag. Story 32. So, I was living in Belgium, and over the summer, most kids would go on summer camps, either at home or abroad. When you turned 13, it was common to go on a 10-day camp in Switzerland. These camps were organized by a nationwide nonprofit, and I was sent along with a couple of my friends. The journey to and from Switzerland was by train. We boarded in our hometown in the morning, and by nightfall, we arrived in a valley town in Wallis. From there, we had to transfer to a regional train that took us up the mountainside. After that, we still had to do a little hiking to reach our camp, which was a youth hostel, holiday resort type place. On day 5, I got sick, headaches, dizziness, nausea, the works. To this day, no one knows why or what exactly happened next. I was taken to a local doctor, but the visit ended with him giving me a shot of something, adrenaline, which sent me into violent convulsions, requiring an emergency ride to the hospital. I still remember the medics talking in that strange Swiss German dialect. I spent 2 nights in the hospital for observation. On the bright side, I had a nice panoramic view of the Alps. The camp guardians were young students themselves, and my parents weren't even informed until I was better and back at camp. For the next few days, I stayed at the resort, resting while the rest of the group went on hikes and other activities. When it was time to go home, we packed up and hiked down to take the regional train back to the valley town, where we'd catch the overnight train to Belgium. But when we got there, we were told that the regional train wasn't running, so we had to hike all the way down to the valley town. I was in no condition to do that, and neither were 2 others from my group who had also fallen ill. So, halfway down, we were told to sit on a few rocks by the side of the road and wait. A car was supposed to come pick us up and take us to the main train station. Of course, that car never came. We sat there for nearly 4 hours, debating what to do. By then, it was nighttime, pitch black. Eventually, we decided to move. We walked for another hour, following the regional train tracks into the center of town, wondering if we had made the right call. We ended up near a train tunnel under a road intersection, where a British tourist couple pulled over. They were wary, understandably so, since we were just 3 unsupervised, foreign kids. It took some convincing, but instead of taking us to the local police station, they drove us to the main train station. Looking back, we were very lucky that they weren't ill-intentioned. I have to hand it to the Swiss railway staff. They didn't freak out too much when we arrived. By then, our group was already well on its way back to Belgium, pretty much on the other side of the country. A few curses and a couple of quick calls later, their train was halted in Basel. Since we had no direct train, it was decided that we'd hitchhike across Switzerland with night freight trains. And that's when the night became unforgettable. We rode in the locomotive with the train drivers. They were incredibly kind, even sharing their midnight meal with us, probably assuming we hadn't had a decent one in hours. At one point, we had to transfer trains, and railway staff guided us across pitch-black tracks with torches, traveling through the moonlit landscapes, where the towering mountains became massive dark silhouettes. It was surreal. Finally, we arrived in Basel. But by then, our group's train had already crossed the French border, while we were still in Switzerland. Thank God for the Schengen Agreement. Crossing the border wasn't too complicated. I remember being handed off by Swiss police to armed French gendarmes. It was weird. We were basically being kicked out of Switzerland and made France's problem. Eventually, we were reunited with our group. There was a lot of celebration that night before we left Basel. We arrived home with a half-day delay. My parents didn't know why at first, so they joked that I was to blame. Their reaction quickly turned to shock, horror, and relief once I told them the full story. Now, 20 years later, I look back on it as both terrifying and incredible. I'm no longer afraid to venture into the unknown, because I learned that there is always a way back home. Story 33. I was 17 and living in Amsterdam, where I had spent most of my life. But this was the year I would be emigrating to Canada, so I knew I had to make the most of it. I had never been a big partier. My parents were fairly strict about curfew and drinking, and as a not-so-popular girl, I just didn't get invited out much. This story takes place on what the Dutch then called Koninginnenacht, Queen's Night. the night before the former queen's birthday, which was always a massive celebration. Basically, the entire city, if not the entire country, would go nuts and party all night. I had never actually gone out for Koninginacht before. My parents didn't want me caught up in all the chaos. Understandable, since I was the youngest of 4 daughters, and they were very protective. But this year was my last chance. Final exams were coming up, and I wanted one wild night with my best friend before I left for good. So I told my mom I'd be sleeping over at my friend's place, and that we'd be staying up late, watching movies. In reality, we were getting dressed up, going out, and getting absolutely wasted. The night started with just the two of us, drinking in the nightlife center of Amsterdam. There was a place selling shots of Jaeger and some kind of sourpuss, 10 shots for €10. Now, keep in mind, we were 17-year-old girls with zero tolerance. After splitting about 30 shots, mostly me, since my friend quickly realized she actually hated Jaeger, we got hungry. So we headed to a McDonald's down the street. She wasn't hungry, but I inhaled a Big Mac meal in about 2 minutes. After that, my friend wanted to meet up with a guy friend of hers who was alone in the city, so we found him and kept wandering around, all of us completely hammered. That's when we got stopped by a random guy on one of the quieter streets. "Hey, you guys want some big fun?" We were too drunk to just walk away, so we actually engaged with him. Turns out he was selling XTC, €5 for a small pill, €10 for a big one. Now, I had smoked weed before, but I had never done anything stronger. And I was so wasted that my brain just did not register how insanely bad of an idea it was to buy cheap drugs from a random stranger. So I reached into my pocket, handed him a 10, and got 2 little pills, one for me, one for my friend. Her guy friend wasn't interested, which, in hindsight, was a good thing. We figured we'd need someone at least kind of sober to make sure we didn't completely screw ourselves over. The dealer told us that since it was our first time, we should just take half now and save the rest for later. So we split our pills in half and took them, and then we just kept walking. About 5 minutes later, my friend decided she wasn't waiting, so she took the other half of her pill. I waited about an hour before taking mine, and then it kicked in. My friend was not having a good time. She sat on the ground, covering her ears and screaming about how everything was too loud. So we got away from the crowd and found a quieter spot. She kept freaking out for a while, but eventually she calmed down, and for no reason at all, she struck up a conversation with a random guy walking by. And just like that, this huge black guy was her new best friend. So now, it was the 4 of us. But since we didn't want to be in the middle of the Koninginacht madness, we started making our way through the quieter, more residential parts of the city, trying to find a park. My friend, meanwhile, was tripping balls, randomly screaming, tripping, at the top of her lungs while making out with her new best friend. We could not find the park. I was still very drunk and getting tired, so we stopped on a porch to rest. And then, suddenly, I felt the drugs. It was like the entire world just brightened in an instant. Suddenly, I wasn't tired anymore. Instead, I started skipping around in circles, loudly declaring, "I was nervous for my finals before, but now I really think everything is going to be perfectly okay." This went on for God knows how long. At some point, we finally split up from the big black guy, which was good, because he kept trying to grab my ass, and it was making me very nervous. Around 5 a.m., we took a cab back to Amstelveen, where my friend lived. The cab ride was hilarious. My friend kept talking about how bald the driver was, then kissing him on the head, then smacking him on the head. Pretty hard, too. I felt bad for the guy. Once we got back, we sat outside by the mall. That's when I remembered I had a ton of energy drinks with me. The night before, I had thought I might need them to stay awake. What did I do next? Apparently, I opened every single can, took one sip, and then kicked the can away. This went on for 16 cans. By now, my friend was back to normal, but I was definitely still on something. We decided to go down to an underground parking garage, where we found a group of younger guys sitting around smoking weed. Naturally, we joined them. We sat there until about 9 a.m. when McDonald's opened, so we all went there. I took one bite of food and realized I wasn't hungry. After that, my friend and I finally went back to her place. You'd think that was the end of the story, but it wasn't. By the time we got back, I was already late to meet up with some other friends who wanted to spend Koninginacht with me. Now, whereas Koninginacht is the wild party, Koninginacht is much more family-friendly. Basically, a giant flea market all over the city. So I met up with my friends. We walked around, got our faces painted. Mine was a ladybug to match my red coat with black polka dots, and just had a normal, chill day. Until we split up to go home. By this point, I was exhausted, still kind of drunk, and definitely hungover. I got on my bike and got hopelessly lost. We hadn't lived in this house in Amsterdam for very long, and the city was packed with street vendors and crowds, blocking off entire roads. I thought, whatever, I'll find my way eventually. I biked for hours. At one point, I somehow ended up at the harbor, which is nowhere near where I needed to be. All the while, I was still in my ladybug coat with my ladybug face paint. Finally, around 5:30 p.m., my mom texted me, "Are you going to be home soon?" At this point, I was completely hopeless, crying, and still very lost. I called her. "Mom, I don't know where I am." She told me to stay put, describe what was around me, and she'd come find me. And she did. She found me, with my smeared, gross ladybug face paint, and we made our way home. After a shower, some food, and a solid 14-hour nap, I was finally back to normal. She must have known something was up. I was seriously not acting normal. But she never brought it up. And neither did I. So there you have it. The dumbest fucking thing I ever did. Could have ended horribly. But actually, it was pretty awesome. Until I got lost. Story 34. This happened just a couple of weeks ago, so it's my go-to story right now. Sorry for the wall of text. My wife and I had been on a cleanse and hadn't had a drink for 21 days. When we finally started again, we got completely trashed on about 4 Coronas each on a Friday night. We came home, had amazing sex, and passed out in a heap. The next morning, we were enjoying a glorious sleep-in when, suddenly, a complete stranger busts open our bedroom door and shouts, "Renee!" Needless to say, we were terrified, but also still half asleep, so logic wasn't exactly firing on all cylinders. Both of us, in our groggy confusion, yelled back, "Who?" As if we were the ones who needed clarification here. "Is Renee here?" she frantically asked. "There's no Renee here," my wife said. "Oh." Then, just like that, the woman closed our door and walked back into our living room. WTF. My wife got up to investigate while I, still lying there, instinctively grabbed the closest weapon, which happened to be the water tank from my humidifier. Again, hungover and barely awake logic. Meanwhile, I started dialing 911, just in case. When my wife went out to confront the woman, it was immediately clear that she was high on something, and it definitely wasn't weed. She had no idea where she was, and was just sitting on our couch like she owned the place. "How did you get in here?" my wife asked. The woman just stared at her with completely spaced out eyes, looking past her, not at her. "Did you come through the back door?" She slowly nodded yes, but didn't really seem to connect with the question. "Okay, well, let's get you back out the door." After some coaxing, letting her use our phone to call her friends, who, shockingly, didn't pick up, and finally lying that we'd take her to Renee if she followed us, she finally left. When she stepped outside, her eyes adjusted to the light, and she suddenly looked at our house and asked, "What street am I on?" When we told her, she said, "Oh, I'm on the wrong street." And then she wandered off. Back inside, my wife checked her phone and saw a missed call from her mom at 4 a.m. Now, we own a duplex. My mother-in-law lives downstairs on one half, and we rent out the other side. But she never calls that late, so we immediately went to check on her. Turns out, at 4 a.m., a woman had been banging on her door asking for Renee and wouldn't leave, even after she and my niece told her that no one by that name lived there. She called us to see if we knew the woman, then called the renter to ask him if he knew her. And then, she just went back to sleep. Mind you, none of us are cops, so I don't know what she thought we would have done, but whatever. We told her we had just kicked this woman out of our house 6 hours later. She asked, how'd she get in? I don't know, we must have left the door unlocked, we said. And then she casually mentioned, "You know, now that you say that, I thought I heard someone moving around upstairs earlier, but I just assumed you guys got my voicemail and got up to do stuff around the house." Ma'am, in what world would we wake up at 4 a.m. and randomly start doing chores without even texting her back? So, from what we could tell, based on the cigarette butts on our back porch and the empty Black Angel dust bags outside, this woman had been coming in and out of our house from about 4:30 a.m. until she woke us up at 10 a.m. Our street has some drug activity, So she probably bought the dust from a nearby drug house, smoked/snorted/shot it. I have no idea how drugs work, and then got separated from her friends. In her dusty little mind, our lit-up house must have looked just like good ol' Renee's place. Needless to say, we now obsessively lock and deadbolt our doors. Asterisk, and in case anyone thinks I'm some lame wife who lets my spouse fight my battles for me, I totally am. But also, I'm a woman, so don't judge me too hard. Story 35. My best friend and I were partners in the egg baby experiment for our psychology class. From the very beginning, we knew we wanted to destroy them in a blaze of glory. Fast forward a year later, during Christmas break, we got our hands on a couple of mortar fireworks that would launch 100 flaming balls of egg baby doom. We carefully scouted locations and finally settled on the darkest, most secluded corner of our high school parking lot. At around 10 p.m., we snuck in, driving with the lights off to avoid attention, like the brilliant college freshmen we were. We decided to document our little mission. After explaining our plan on film, we stepped out of the car, ready to send off our children in a spectacular farewell. And then, flashlights, a voice barking, "Put your hands where we can see them and turn around." We froze. The only logical conclusion? The two cops must have parked behind the building and army crawled 50 feet across the parking lot just to ambush us. They addressed me first. Important context. The day before, I had wisdom teeth surgery, and I was still loopy from painkillers. This was an actual nightmare in the flesh. "You dropped something. What did you drop? What are you doing here?" one of the cops demanded. I stared at him. I couldn't have answered even if I wanted to. Instead, I just bleated like a sheep. "Come on, spit it out," he snapped. "We wanted to destroy our egg babies," my friend Alex blurted out, visibly shaking. "You're what?" I finally found my voice. "Our egg babies. That's what I dropped." I turned toward the car and revealed the tiny, smiling eggshell, complete with a pink bow where its forehead would have been. Silence. The cops just stared at us, completely at a loss for words. Then, the first cop shifted gears. "Have you boys been doing any drugs?" "Do you have any drugs in the car?" he asked Alex. "No. We have a duffel bag of fireworks in the back seat, but that's all. I swear." Cop number one helped himself into the back seat and began digging through our stuff while we stood there, drowning in fear and pure disillusionment. Cop number two, meanwhile, casually scanned our duffel bag like a kid at a candy store. He paused when he saw our mortar firework, picked it up, and read the label. "Shoots 100 flaming balls." He chuckled. As his partner spoke with the dispatcher over the radio, my friend Jay, who had been completely silent up to this point, finally chimed in. "We like that part." Cop number two barked out a laugh and put the mortar back into the bag just as his partner finished checking the car. Then came the moment of truth. "All right, here's what's going to happen." We held our breath. The tension was overwhelming. "We're going to take this bag here and pretend none of this ever happened. I know it's vacation and you boys are bored, but you can't be trespassing on school property with illegal contraband. So you boys are going to get in the car, go home, and spend the rest of the night there." There was no telling us twice. We all knew we had just been insanely lucky to walk away without even a warning. We quietly filed back into the car and drove away without a word. In the back of my mind, I couldn't help but wonder, how long would it be before we heard the sounds of those cops enjoying their new stash of fireworks? Story 36. I was probably pre-kindergarten age. To be honest, I never asked exactly how old I was when this happened. In those days, it was common for kids my age to wander the block unsupervised. My father was using the time to make much-needed repairs around the house. Unsupervised was never truly alone. There were several kids my age, and the parents could rely on the fact that I was never really by myself. After some time passed, my dad heard me come inside, alone for once, which was somewhat odd. "Dad, what's up, DACU?" he asked, probably not looking up from whatever job he was working on, either tearing down walls or fixing the dilapidated fireplace. How do you catch a snake? It's important to understand that, at this age, parents knew all the answers, and my dad was, some say still is, fond of providing an answer to anything, whether it was grounded in truth or simply pulled from the air around him. He grunted, still focused on his task, but he could never pass up an opportunity to impart knowledge, wisdom, or, in my case, simple 6-year-old logic. "Well, if it's a big snake, I'd dump water on it to make it curl up, and when it does, I'd cover it with a bucket. Do we have a bucket? Grunting again, he nodded toward the 5-gallon pail that commonly decorated household projects in my memory. Where do I get water from? Use the hose, but don't fill it too full or you won't be able to carry it, he suggested. Don't worry, Rob will help me carry it. Then I disappeared for some time, according to my dad's recollection, confident that I was with a friend and probably tormenting some garter snake on the block. Dad kept working away. Still elbow deep in his project, he looked up to see me run through the front door. Dad, I exclaimed proudly, you really have to come see this. What's going on? He asked. We caught the snake. I did just like you said, and I caught it. My triumph rang clear from a job well done. Maybe in a bit, he mumbled, as always focused on the task at hand. Dad, I said with urgency, a tone learned from years of experience. We need you to come see this right away. Where is it? End of the block, on the corner, I assured him, confident that the trip would be worth the bother. Sighing, he agreed to follow me outside to where Rob was supposedly guarding the snake I had caught. A couple of things to paint the picture. First, the house we lived in was in the dead center of a standard Midwestern block. So when I said on the corner, I meant 4 houses away from ours. Second, the outdoor hose I had used was on the far side of our house, quite a distance from the corner in question. Third, my dad assumed, as any reasonable parent would, that the boys had been playing with the biggest snake possible in our area, maybe a 6-inch long garter snake. Absolutely harmless. This wasn't Australia. We stepped outside, and the first thing he noticed was that the sidewalk was absolutely drenched. Every foot or so, there was evidence of a little boy carrying and spilling water over and over on his way down the block. He still says I probably dropped more water than what actually made it to the corner. When we reached the corner, we found Rob waiting, sitting on the upside-down pail, smiling. The sidewalk was fully drenched, but now my dad realized there was a shadow within the bucket. See, Dad, I said, triumph again plain in my voice. It worked. I caught it. Dad looked around. As expected for midday, there was no one else around. Obviously, this hadn't drawn a crowd. But that shadow under the bucket made him wary, and he told Rob to step back. Then he kicked over the bucket. Out unfolded a snake that was at least 5 feet long. This was a surprise, one worthy of stepping back and reassessing the situation, making sure we were clear of whatever kind of beast had no business being here. It took him a minute to process what had just happened. DECU, he said in a tone that brooked no argument. Stay away from it. I need to call someone. But Dad, you let it out. I complained in what I'm sure now was probably the same whiny tone Luke Skywalker used when he wanted to be anywhere but his uncle's farm. Now I have to catch it again. Absolutely not. Stay away from it. The order was clear. He ran back home to call the cops. Now, for more scene setting. If you haven't guessed already, this was long before the age of cell phones or even the internet, before we could just Google, what kind of snake is this? My dad's only thought was to call the experts, the police. Call made, and as a small crowd finally began to gather, 2 officers arrived, got the story from my father, and stepped back to confer. Dad revised his estimate of the snake's size, probably longer than him and pretty thick around the middle. The police then realized animal control was not immediately available, and just as they were deciding what to do, the snake, now recovered from the cold water bath I had given it, began to slither down the sidewalk. The police had to act. Again, I must stress, Google, or even Gopher, had not been invented yet. With no online forums to post questions about snake identification, and being native Midwesterners, neither officer had any idea if this thing was venomous or not. So, for the next 20 minutes, they attempted to get an uncooperative snake into a hastily acquired garbage bag, without touching it. Dad swears this effort included trying to bat or lift the thing using the non-business end of a shotgun hastily retrieved from the squad car. The growing crowd watched as attempt after attempt failed. Then, suddenly, a young woman stepped in and asked what the police were trying to do. She didn't wait for an answer. She just walked up, scooped the snake up, and let it wrap around her arm. It turned out to be a boa constrictor, probably an escaped pet. We never found out where it came from. Dad vividly remembers the girl, who he insists was smaller than the snake she was holding, glaring at the officers. They sheepishly lowered the shotgun they had been using as a makeshift snake wrangling stick. Defeated, They turned to see animal control finally pulling up. I didn't get to keep it. Story 37. Not sure if it's a good story, but here goes. It was 2007. I weighed over 400 pounds, but I still tried to walk off the weight. This was before I was put on the track for gastric bypass surgery. My morning class at the community college had just ended, and I decided to walk down to the local bookstore. At the time, there were two, a Barnes & Noble in the mall, 3.5 miles from the college, and a Borders just 300 feet up the road from that. Borders was my favorite because I could get a good cup of coffee without paying Starbucks prices. Halfway down the road, just past the New York Life office, a car pulled over. The woman driving rolled down her window and asked for directions to a certain hotel. I knew it was just down the road, second right at the Rotary and straight on for 3 miles. I gave her the directions, and she thanked me before turning to her husband in the passenger seat and saying, "Told you he'd know." I didn't think much of it and kept walking. When I got to the bookstore, I grabbed a mocha in one hand and the latest Dresden Files book in the other. As I was browsing, someone said, "Excuse me?" I looked up. It was the woman from before. She slid an envelope into my book and said, "Read the message and come see me in the parking lot." I opened the envelope. Inside was a note that read, "My husband and I are chubby chasers, and we want to invite you to spend a night with us that ends in a 3-way. Come out to my car out front and tell us what you think." I remember blushing beet red. Then, after a moment, I went outside to see them. Was I curious? Hell yeah. But I also realized I didn't want my first, and maybe only, sexual encounter to happen because of the part of me I hated. I turned them down, but I do still wonder what would have happened if I hadn't. Story 38. Jamie Lee Curtis took a dog off my hands. I was working on a film she starred in when I noticed a little dog running around the studio. A cute, tricolored coonhound. I took it to the vet and found out it had heartworms. Part of the treatment for heartworms requires the dog to remain calm and quiet for a couple of weeks while the worms in its heart are slowly killed by the medication. To keep it safe, I tied it under the special effects trailer with plenty of food and water and put up signs asking the crew not to feed him steak, chicken, or lobster. Ms. Curtis' nanny said she'd like to adopt him. I said fine. Jamie Lee asked how much I had spent on him. I told her $400, and damned if she didn't insist on reimbursing me. I also warned her, never, ever let this dog off a leash in the real world. It was born to run, and if it gets loose, you'll never catch it. She left the dog in the care of some friends on Hilton Head Island while we moved the shoot to Virginia. The dog ran away. I'm sure it became the healthiest stray on Hilton Head. A month later, I was stranded on a floating set in the middle of the James River in Norfolk, Virginia, with her. We had very little to do and got to know each other. At one point, I asked if she liked poetry. Before I could even finish my sentence, she emphatically said, "No." She explained, "I always feel like I'm listening in on someone else's private joke. I never feel like the poet actually wants me in on it." Or something along those lines. I told her she had just been poorly introduced to poetry and that I'd do it right the second time. I got her a copy of Dwarf Bamboo, I think, by Marilyn Chin. She later told me she loved it. She was probably lying just to be nice. In return, she bought me some CDs to listen to. One of them was by Laura Love. It was pretty good. She also gave me a copy of her first book about the story of her daughter's adoption. I had her sign it. Later, I gifted that book to some friends when their daughter was born. Years down the line, when we adopted our own daughter, Olive, it hit me. What a stupendously bad move that had been. I've always thought about contacting her publicist. She also introduced me to her mom, who was still beautiful. Yeah, Jamie Lee was a pretty cool chick. Story 39. I got to tell the Speaker of the House of Commons to fuck off and get away with it. I was a special constable, a volunteer police officer for the Metropolitan Police, assigned to public aid duty for the London Marathon. My serial was posted at Westminster Underground Station. At first, we didn't have much to do other than chat with the crowd and enjoy the weather as the elite runners passed. But once the rest of the runners started crossing Westminster Bridge, the crowd movement increased, making it almost impossible for anyone to go against the flow to enter the underground station. To manage this, we set up a cordon to ensure that movement was strictly one way. I was stationed at the cordon, redirecting people to the other entrance, when a short man with a shock of white hair approached me. "I'm sorry, sir, it's one way only. If you turn around and go up Derby Gate, you can enter through the other entrance." He looked at me for a moment and then said, let me past. I need to go there," pointing toward the Houses of Parliament. Me, "Very good, sir. If you just turn around and go up Derby Gate, you can reach the station and use the underpass." Him, "No, I want to go that way." Me, "You can't. It's one way only. Turn around and go up Derby Gate." Him, "You don't understand. I'm a member of Parliament." Me, "Congratulations. I'm a police officer. Turn around and go up Derby Gate." At this point, I was beginning to lose my temper. Him, "I'm the speaker and I want to go." Me, "Enough. It is a one-way system. Turn around, go up Derby Gate, and fuck off." The moment I said it, I realized what had just come out of my mouth. He looked at me as if I had insulted 10 generations of his family. Him, "I want to speak to your sergeant." Before I could say anything, my sergeant, who must have been listening in, materialized out of thin air. The speaker quickly tattled on me, explaining what had happened before I could get a word in. My sergeant listened, then simply shrugged and said, "Sergeant, well, sounds to me like you'd better fuck off." One very red-faced, short man with white hair, now marching off angrily toward Derby Gate. Story 40. When I was in high school, I decided to get an after-school job to save up money for a car. I ended up working at the local fast food joint. Of course, it was absolute hell. My boss was a dick, the customers were dicks, and the employees occasionally served raw chicken. My coworkers were all short and female, so I got stuck doing all the reaching, heavy lifting, and, somehow, learning Punjabi. A customer once shot me in the face with a paintball gun, but that's a different story. Since this was one of the most troubled locations in our chain, managers came and went every few months. The real trouble started with what I think was our fourth store manager. This woman was a monster. One minute, she would talk to you in this creepy, overly nice way, and the next, she'd be threatening to take away your breaks. She piled extra tasks onto my already impossible workload and even told me she'd cut my pay if I couldn't keep up. She also had this obsession with being right about everything. If we were doing a task correctly, she'd jump in and demand we do it her way, even if her way was completely wrong. When we followed her instructions, she'd circle back, scold us, and tell us to do it properly, which was exactly what we were doing in the first place. But the worst part? The stories. If you spoke about literally anything, she would immediately cut in with a better story of her own. It was obvious she was making most of them up. One day, she told the girls a story about a new cat she had just adopted. One of my coworkers, who was fed up with her bullshit, asked her to bring a photo. The next day, Psycho Bitch walked in with a picture of a cat. Later that shift, while she was busy elsewhere, the girls were in the back, pissed because she had just announced she was taking away their coffee breaks. They started talking about the cat photo, and how it was probably not even her cat. At that moment, I had a thought. It was extremely important to this woman to be included and to be seen as important. She was an ugly, unlikable person, not physically, but in every way that mattered, and she was desperate to force relationships with people. I suggested to the girls that not only was the photo fake, but that I could prove it. Now, this was the early days of Google image search, and most people had no idea it existed. But I had a hunch. I told them that exposing her would destroy her. They loved it. They told me to get proof and post it on the wall for everyone to see. It took me 5 minutes on Google to find the exact same cat photo. Another 5 minutes to track down the original source, complete with a picture of the cat and its real owner. Perfect. That night, before I left, I printed the proof and posted it on the door of the manager's office. I didn't work the next day, but when I came in the day after, the photo was gone. Nobody said a word about it. And Psycho Bitch, she never showed up again. For the next 6 months, her name was still on the wall, and the supervisors still referred to her as the store manager. Eventually, I asked one of them why, and he told me she had a medical issue and was on long-term leave. A few days later, a notice went up saying she was no longer the store manager. Years later, after I had quit, I ran into one of the girls, who had since been promoted to district manager. She finally told me what really happened. Psycho Bitch came in the morning after I posted the photo. When she saw it, she lost her mind. She went absolutely insane, so bad that the girls had to call the cops. She was taken to some kind of facility. I was surprised, but honestly, it made sense. It explained why everyone had been so quiet about it. A person was destroyed. If you enjoyed the video, don't forget to leave a like and subscribe. activate the notification bell, and share a similar story or anything you'd like to say in the comments. See you next time.